I was standing at the altar, dressed in the gown I once believed would mark the beginning of a beautiful life, when my sister-me-only family since our mother passed walked down the aisle wearing a wedding dress nearly identical to mine. The guests gasped, confused, but I didn't need a single word to understand what was happening. The betrayal was right there, playing out in front of everyone I cared about. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 25, and on what should have been the happiest day of my life, inside a lakeside chapel in Vermont, I discovered the man I loved and the sister I trusted with every piece of my heart had been lying to me all along. Not only were they having an affair, but they had planned this together to humiliate me, take my money, and build a life without me. But what they didn't know is that I saw it coming, and I had a plan of my own. Running my family's inn in Windermere wasn't just a job I inherited, it was my entire world, a quiet refuge built from my parents' dreams and my own determination to keep them alive after they passed. I had poured every ounce of myself into that place, from the hand-polished floors to the framed memories that lined the lobby walls. Most guests came and went without leaving a mark, but one spring afternoon, a man walked through the doors who would change everything. I noticed him the moment he stepped out of the town car, tall, sharply dressed, and carrying the kind of confidence that didn't need announcing. His navy suit was tailored, his watch caught the light just enough to hint at wealth without flaunting it, and he barely glanced up from his phone until he reached the counter. "Evening," he said with a voice smooth and easy like a polished lie. "Name's Nathan Carlisle, just in town for a few days. Anything interesting I should see around here?" He smiled as he spoke, not the kind of smile you forget, and for a second, I felt like the only person in the room. I handed him the key to room 203, trying not to overthink the sudden flush in my cheeks. "That depends," I said, returning the smile despite myself. "Are you looking for trouble or something quieter?" His laugh was low and warm, the kind that lingers, and though our exchange was brief, it stayed with me long after he took the stairs 2 at a time to his room. Nathan didn't stay long. He came and went with a quiet elegance, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be, yet never in a hurry. On his last morning, after he'd checked out and the room was already being cleaned, I found a note tucked under the bell at the front desk. Written in confident, looping script, it said, "Enjoyed our talk. Dinner tonight?" That was it. No number, no pressure. Just an open door. I hesitated. Mixing business with personal life had never been my style, not when the inn was my legacy, and not when my sister and I had built everything from the ground up after losing our parents. But there was something about Nathan that slipped past my usual defenses, something I couldn't quite explain. And, in a moment of quiet bravery, I called the number he'd left on the back of the room card and agreed. We met at the Grayson Tavern, a dimly lit spot just outside the city, where the scent of wood smoke lingered in the air and the music was soft enough that you could actually hear the person across from you. When he greeted me, he looked genuinely pleased, and as we sat in the corner booth, the conversation flowed with an ease I hadn't felt in years. He asked thoughtful questions, really listened, and when he laughed, it was always with his eyes first. He told me stories of traveling across Europe, of investments that made and broke fortunes, of lessons learned too late and second chances earned. When the conversation turned to me, I found myself opening up more than I'd planned. I spoke about the inn, about how I'd taken over after Mom died, and Dad followed soon after, about how it had just been me and my sister Danielle since I was barely 20. Nathan didn't pity me instead, he looked at me like I was made of steel and glass all at once. "You've carried more than most," he said quietly. "That kind of strength doesn't come easy." I shrugged it off, unsure how to respond to someone seeing through me so easily. "We all play the hand we're dealt," I said, trying to make light of it, but the truth was, I hadn't felt seen, really seen in a long time. I told him about the small inheritance our parents had left, how I'd used it carefully, growing the inn into something stable, something we could be proud of. He nodded, thoughtful, and sipped his bourbon with a slow appreciation, like everything I said mattered. I should have noticed it then how he always deflected when I asked about his family, how he joked that holidays were overrated and said his parents preferred distance. There was always a shadow in his eyes when I brought it up, but I didn't press. I knew better than anyone that family could be complicated, and sometimes silence was safer than truth. By the time we left the tavern, I realized I hadn't laughed that much in years. There was a lightness to the night that felt rare, and as we stood beside my car under the amber glow of the parking lot lights, he gently brushed a curl behind my ear and said, This feels easy." And right. I nodded, unable to say what I was feeling, because it was all tangled up in hope and fear and the quiet ache of wanting something real again. That night, as I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling fan spinning above me, I thought maybe, just maybe, this could be something worth believing in. But I didn't know then, of course, that believing in Nathan Carlisle would cost me more than I'd ever imagined. I only knew that, in that moment, something in me had shifted, and that I had just invited a stranger into my world, not realizing he had already mapped out how to burn it down. After that dinner at Grayson Tavern, something began to shift between us subtly at first, like the slow bloom of spring after a long winter, and before I could catch my breath, Nathan had become part of my everyday. He wasn't just a guest who had lingered longer than expected. He was suddenly showing up with coffee in hand before my early check-ins, helping me rearrange furniture in the inn's dining room, and asking about things no one else had ever cared to notice: the family recipes I kept behind the counter, the old record player in the back office that only worked when you gave it a gentle smack on the side. He made the ordinary feel like something rare, and when you've lived enough years hiding hurt behind habit, you start to believe that maybe joy doesn't need to come in grand gestures. Maybe it's in the way someone remembers how you take your tea or folds a blanket at the foot of the bed you're too tired to make. Nathan was attentive, patient in a way that didn't feel performative. He noticed when my sister Danielle's calls left me silent and distracted, and never pried, just quietly offered to drive me down to the lake when he knew I needed space. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, and when he looked at me, I didn't feel like someone struggling to hold things together. I felt like someone worth holding on to. One evening, as we sat on the front porch wrapped in flannel and the last golden slants of sunlight, I told him about the inn's beginnings, how my parents bought the place with savings they'd scraped together over years of working night shifts and double jobs, how they poured love into every beam and brick, how I'd inherited it far sooner than expected after we lost them both in the same cruel year. I admitted how lost I'd felt at 20, barely old enough to legally drink and suddenly running a business while raising myself and trying to keep my sister from drifting into the wrong crowds. He listened without interruption, his expression soft and steady, and when I fell silent, unsure if I'd shared too much, he reached over and took my hand like he wasn't just holding it, but anchoring me. "You carry all that with grace," he said quietly, his thumb tracing a slow line across my knuckles. "Most people would have given up, Margaret. But you built something beautiful out of grief." It was a kind of kindness I hadn't known how much I needed, and maybe that's why I let the walls down, not all at once, but gently, like peeling off layers that had long since hardened to armor. I started letting him into the parts of my life I usually kept guarded. He helped me redo the guest registry system, introduced me to a friend who could lower our supply costs, and even painted one of the spare rooms when I mentioned it needed updating. When I tried to pay him back for his help, he only laughed and said, "I'm investing in us, not your paint." Looking back, I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed harder when he dismissed my curiosity about his past with vague answers, or when his stories about investments and business ventures changed slightly depending on the day. But I was tired, not just physically, but soul-deep tired of carrying everything on my own. And for once, it felt like someone else was standing beside me, not behind me or waiting for me to fail. Nathan had a way of dreaming out loud that made everything seem possible. On late-night walks under the stars, he'd talk about buying a second property upstate, about converting an old barn into a wedding venue, about turning my family inn into a hospitality brand not to chase wealth, he said, but to build a life worth waking up to. "Why not us?" He'd whisper into my hair as we sat curled on the couch. "You and me, Margaret, we could be unstoppable." I wanted to believe it. God help me, I did. So when he brought up the idea of marriage, it didn't feel sudden, it felt inevitable, like the next chapter we were already living in. He didn't get down on one knee or present a ring with fanfare. Instead, he handed me a folded piece of paper one morning with the words "life plan" scribbled at the top, and inside it was a vision. Our wedding, a honeymoon in Scotland, and a timeline to turn the inn into a full-fledged boutique retreat. "We don't need tradition," he said, pulling me close. "We need a future. Let's start building it." There was logic in his proposal, not just romance. He offered to match my savings for the wedding and use his connections to handle the licensing and venue coordination. We'd keep costs down by combining our funds and relying on some of the people he knew, planners, suppliers, even a friend who worked in international travel. It all sounded too convenient, too perfect, but when you're in love, sometimes convenience just feels like fate in disguise. I remember hesitating, the practical part of me whispering warnings I had learned to listen to over the years. But when I looked into his eyes, steady, warm, and full of promises I so badly wanted to trust, I silenced those thoughts and nodded. "Yes," I said, "let's make this real." What I didn't realize then was that the future we were building wasn't ours, it was his, and I was just the foundation he planned to walk away from once he was done building. Once I said yes, the days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else, some version of me who hadn't yet learned how fragile joy could be, how easy it was to mistake urgency for passion and control for care. Nathan didn't waste a minute after my agreement. He dove into planning with the energy of a man chasing down a dream, and I, swept up in the current of his momentum, let myself believe this was what building a life together looked like. He spoke of the wedding as if it were a grand production, a declaration to the world of everything we had become and everything we would become. "Let's make it unforgettable," he said one morning as we sat in the breakfast nook, sunlight spilling across papers and bridal catalogs. "You've spent your whole life giving to others, it's time someone gave to you." His words were kind, and the way he said them made me feel treasured, but beneath the sweetness was a quiet persuasion I didn't immediately recognize. He suggested we combine resources, and it made sense at first. No use draining one account when we could plan smarter, he reasoned, drawing up spreadsheets that tracked every flower, every fork, every guest. My savings money I had guarded with the cautious love of someone who had scraped for every cent were suddenly poured into deposits and down payments. I told myself it was worth it, that love required trust, and that building a future meant loosening the grip on the past. But in the quiet moments, when I stared at the withdrawal receipts and the calendar filled with deadlines, a whisper of unease stirred in the corners of my mind. Nathan handled everything. He charmed vendors, negotiated contracts, and found a photographer who owed him a favor. He was efficient, enthusiastic, and somehow always 2 steps ahead, which I had once found admirable, but now, on certain days, felt oddly unsettling. I tried to stay involved, but every time I offered input, a song choice, a menu preference, a color palette, he'd smile warmly and say, "Leave the stress to me, sweetheart. You've done enough heavy lifting in life. Let me carry this one." And I let him. There's a strange comfort in being taken care of when you're so used to surviving alone, and I'd spent years being the one who fixed things, who paid the bills and signed the papers and handled the hard stuff without flinching. To be with someone who not only wanted to share the weight, but insisted on carrying more, it felt like love. Or at least, it felt like what I imagined love should be. The venue he chose was a lakeside estate in upstate New York, surrounded by maple trees and gardens that would bloom just in time for the ceremony. "It's symbolic," he said with a wink. "A new season, a new life." He talked about lighting and music and drone footage, about invitations printed on handmade paper and a string quartet flown in from Boston. I remember laughing and asking if we were planning a royal wedding, and he just kissed my forehead and said, "Only the best for the woman I'm going to marry." But there were moments, small, quiet ones, when a strange chill would creep in beneath all that warmth. Like the way he always kept the budget documents on his laptop but never shared access, claiming it was easier to manage from one place. Or how he'd redirect conversations anytime I brought up a prenuptial agreement, teasing that I was being too formal for something so beautiful and real. "You trust me, don't you?" he'd ask, and I'd nod, even as something deep in my gut twisted. And then there were the calls. Brief, whispered ones he took in the hallway or out on the porch when he thought I was busy. He'd return smiling, his tone light, but his answers vague, "Just business," or "My guy in finance, he worries too much." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. After all, weren't we building a life together? Still, I couldn't silence the doubts completely. So one afternoon, I called my sister Danielle, hoping that maybe just hearing her voice would help settle something inside me. "He's doing everything," I told her, pacing the guest room that had turned into a wedding planning command center. "He's kind, he's generous, but sometimes I feel like I'm watching my own wedding happen from the sidelines. She laughed in that easy older sister way and said, "That's love, Maggie. You've always been the one in control. Maybe now it's just your turn to be taken care of." And I clung to that, her words, the vision, the promise. Because what would it say about me if I questioned a man who had done nothing but adore me, who had turned my quiet world into something that shimmered with possibility? So I kept smiling. I kept nodding. I kept writing checks and pretending the shadows weren't growing longer with each passing week. What I didn't realize not yet was that while I was planning a future, Nathan had been scripting an exit. That the same hands that held me at night were busy stitching together a betrayal so precise, so coldly orchestrated, it would leave me breathless in the worst way. And by the time I saw it clearly, I'd be standing in the very chapel we had picked together, with my savings gone and my trust shattered, wondering how I ever mistook control for love. With the wedding drawing closer, the days began to blur into one another, a steady stream of decisions and distractions that made it easy to ignore the unease I hadn't yet found the courage to name. The flowers were chosen, the guest list was finalized, and the invitations had been sent, each one a little paper promise that the life I'd longed for was finally becoming real. But beneath the surface of that joy, something quieter had begun to stir, not a scream, not even a whisper, but the faintest flicker of instinct, the kind you learn to trust only after it's too late. I wanted my sister with me. Danielle had always been my compass, even when we didn't agree, especially when we didn't agree, and though she lived 2 hours away and had been consumed with work at the cafe she managed, I called her one morning and asked if she could come help me pick out the dress. "Think you can ditch the espresso machine long enough to play maid of honor for a day?" I asked, my voice lighter than I felt. Her laugh came through the line, familiar and warm. "For you, Maggie. I'll trade caffeine for chiffon in a heartbeat. Give me an hour." When she walked into the bridal boutique, the world tilted slightly in that way. It always did when someone you love enters the room. She looked the same: jeans, boots, a jacket 2 sizes too big, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite place. It passed quickly, hidden behind her usual teasing grin as she pulled a veil from a rack and placed it crookedly on her own head. "Think I could pull this off? Or would they ask me to bus tables at the reception?" She joked, and I laughed, grateful for her presence, even if something inside me paused. The boutique was a dream, all silk and soft lighting, mirrors that caught every shimmer of lace and beads. As I slipped into the 5th dress of the afternoon, I caught Danielle's expression shift again just for a second as I stepped out from behind the curtain. "That one?" she said, her voice steady but her eyes too focused, too still. "It's like it was made for you." I smiled, unsure whether the tears in my eyes were from joy or fatigue, but hers remained dry. She asked if she could try one on, just for fun, she said, lifting a gown that sparkled faintly under the lights. I blinked in surprise. Danielle had never been the dreamy wedding planning type. I couldn't recall her ever talking about marriage with more than a shrug. "Thinking of eloping? Or is there someone you've forgotten to tell me about?" I teased. Her laugh came a beat too late, just a little too sharp. "You know me," she replied, slipping behind the curtain. "Always a bridesmaid, never a bride." The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a slow waltz, all polite smiles and shared memories, but underneath the laughter, something felt off. It was in the way she seemed distracted when I spoke about Nathan, in how she changed the subject when I mentioned how fast everything was moving, and in the way she avoided eye contact when I asked if she'd bring a date to the wedding. Later that night, as we sat on the porch with mugs of chamomile and a blanket wrapped around our knees, I asked if everything was all right. "You've seemed different lately. Is it just stress?" I offered, hoping she'd meet me halfway. She waved her hand dismissively, blaming it on the chaos at work, on burnout, on the pressure of being short-staffed. But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and when she said she was happy for me, I couldn't help but hear something else, hidden in the spaces between her words. After she left that evening, promising to return the week of the wedding, I stood alone in the kitchen with a lingering chill I couldn't explain. The dress was hanging in the spare bedroom, perfectly pressed and waiting, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Something had shifted that day, not enough to call it out loud, but enough that I couldn't push it away. Danielle and I had always known each other too well. We'd shared grief, scraped by through seasons of scarcity, and protected each other from heartbreak that came in many forms. But now, for the first time in my life, it felt like there were pages missing from her story, pages I didn't know how to read and wasn't sure she wanted me to find. I tried to dismiss it, told myself that change was part of growing older, that distance didn't always mean deceit. I tried to believe that she, of all people, would never hide something from me. But deep down, in that quiet part of the soul that knows before the mind dares to ask, I could feel it coming. Something was wrong. And I was about to find out just how wrong it really was. It was a quiet Thursday morning, one of those rare days where everything felt deceptively still, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm you never see coming. I had just finished making coffee, the kind Nathan liked, strong, dark, no sugar, and was tidying up the apartment we'd started sharing in the months leading up to the wedding. He had left in a rush, muttering something about a last-minute meeting with the caterer, his phone still in hand as he pulled on his coat, but in his haste, he'd left it behind, sitting face-up on the kitchen counter, vibrating softly every few minutes like a heart that wouldn't rest. At first, I didn't think anything of it. We'd always respected each other's space, or at least I believed we had, and I had never felt the need to check his messages, not until that morning, when something in the rhythm of those vibrations began to feel wrong. One after another. Unread. Persistent. I glanced at the screen. A string of preview messages glowed beneath a name I hadn't seen in a long time. Danielle. My sister. I didn't open the phone right away. For a full minute, I stood there, my hand hovering over it like it might burn me. Maybe it was innocent, I told myself. Maybe it was about the wedding details, surprises, sisterly excitement. But even as I thought it, my chest tightened. The phone wasn't even locked, as if he hadn't expected to need to hide anything at all. That, somehow, felt like the cruelest detail of all. When I finally tapped the screen, it was like stepping into a world I didn't recognize, a world that had been spinning beside me all along, silently, while I went about choosing flowers and writing vows. The messages were clear, horrifyingly so. There were no metaphors or codes, no misinterpretations to soften the blow, just words. Words from my sister, words from the man I was about to marry. We pulled it off. She's so wrapped up in the planning she has no clue. Once the baby's born, we're done pretending. This wedding her money, it sets us up for everything we need. My vision blurred, but I kept scrolling, each line carving into me with surgical precision. Danielle had written about the pregnancy casually, cruelly, as though it were a transaction, a guarantee of permanence. And Nathan, the man who had once told me I was the strongest woman he'd ever met, had responded not with fear or guilt, but with glee. She's just a naive little safety net, he had typed, followed by a string of laughing emojis that felt like bullets. Let her foot the bill. We'll disappear after the honeymoon. She won't know what hit her. My knees gave way before I realized I had even moved. I sank to the floor, the cold tiles pressing against my skin, grounding me in the unbearable reality that my sister, my blood, my only living family had conspired with the man I had trusted most to dismantle me from the inside out. I had spent months believing I was building a future, when in truth, I had been financing my own ruin, brick by brick, blind and hopeful and completely alone. The silence in the apartment, once comforting, now felt cavernous, echoing with every lie I had mistaken for love. I thought of the late-night calls Danielle had brushed off, the dress she had tried on at the boutique just for fun, the way Nathan had kept the budget locked on his laptop. The pieces, once disjointed and confusing, now clicked into place with devastating clarity. They hadn't just betrayed me, they had planned it together with a precision so heartless it left no room for misunderstanding. Every word I had spoken to them in confidence, every sacrifice, every detail I had shared from the depths of my grief and hope had been twisted into tools for manipulation. They had studied me not out of love, but out of strategy. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Something inside me had cracked, but it hadn't shattered, not yet. Because once the initial wave of disbelief passed, once the ache stopped swallowing the air from my lungs, something else stirred, something colder, sharper, more resolute. I placed the phone back on the counter exactly as he had left it. I wiped the tears from my chin. And I stood. I knew in that moment I would not confront them with rage or tears. I would not beg for answers or apologies. They had written me off as fragile, a romantic fool too blind to see her own downfall. But what they failed to realize was that I was not broken. I was awake. And now that I knew the truth, I would not let it crush me. I would let it guide me to something far more powerful than heartbreak. I would give them the wedding they planned. I would smile, walk the aisle, wear the dress. I would give them everything they expected until the moment I gave them something they never saw coming. After I read the final message, I didn't scream. I didn't cry into a pillow or hurl his phone across the room, though every muscle in my body itched to react, to do something that would release the storm now surging beneath my skin. But instead, I placed the phone back exactly where I found it, screen down, the silence around me now deafening in its weight. I made myself a cup of tea I wouldn't drink, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window at a world that hadn't changed, even though mine had. From that moment forward, I knew I couldn't afford outrage. Not yet. Not if I wanted to survive this with more than just dignity. I had trusted Nathan with my heart and Danielle with my blood, and together they had plotted to rob me of both. But what they hadn't accounted for, what their texts and schemes failed to consider, was that beneath the softness they had so easily dismissed, I carried something far more enduring than naivety. I carried memory. I carried silence. And I knew how to use both. So I did the only thing that made sense. I played my part. I smiled, nodded, laughed at their jokes, and marveled at floral arrangements. I praised Danielle for her support, told Nathan he was too good to be true, and let them both believe that I was still asleep inside the dream they had built for me, a dream now calcified into a prison I had no intention of staying in. But behind closed doors, I began to prepare. I contacted a lawyer, an old friend of my father's, a man who didn't ask why I was asking about asset protection and name transfers, but simply listened, nodded, and told me exactly what I needed to do. I secured every document Nathan had ever touched, every receipt, every email, every shared password he thought I had forgotten. I printed the messages from his phone and stored them in a folder I kept hidden beneath the floorboard of my old writing desk, the one he never paid attention to because it was scratched and smelled faintly of cedar. Every night, after he fell asleep beside me, arms draped casually across my waist like he hadn't conspired to destroy me, I would lie there in the dark, rehearsing my timing, counting my steps. I learned to quiet my breath, to steady my pulse, to smile through the taste of blood in my mouth. He would whisper plans for our future, his breath warm against my skin, while my mind spun quietly behind my eyes, weaving a tapestry of controlled vengeance. I began recording phone calls. I traced payments. I installed software to monitor shared devices. And slowly, methodically, I began transferring what remained of my savings into a private account under a name they wouldn't recognize, a trust I created under my mother's maiden name, safeguarded by someone who owed me no loyalty except the professional kind. The more Nathan planned, the more Danielle visited, the more I listened. I watched them both with the calm patience of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting not for the wind to push them, but for the precise moment to jump and pull them down with her. There were moments when it almost broke me, like the day I caught Danielle humming in the kitchen, her hand unconsciously resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. I had always wanted to be an aunt, and for a fleeting second, I remembered her as the girl who used to braid my hair while I cried over boys who didn't matter. But the softness vanished the moment I remembered the message. She's such a fool, she doesn't even suspect a thing. I suspected everything now. Still, I held my tongue. When Nathan kissed my temple and whispered about how lucky he was, I smiled and whispered back. When he proposed adding his name to the inn's license for legal convenience, I told him we could talk about it after the honeymoon. When Danielle suggested we go dress shopping again, just us girls, I said I'd love that, and then went home to review footage from the hidden camera I'd placed in the office where they often met. They believed I was unraveling with wedding stress, but in truth, I was becoming something sharper, something steadier than I had ever been. The mask I wore was flawless, gentle, trusting, even fragile at times, and they drank it in like wine, never stopping to wonder if the sweetness might be laced with something more dangerous. Every day was a performance. Every glance, every gesture, a careful line in the script I was rewriting in real time. They thought I was the bride. They thought I was the victim. But what they didn't know was that I was the director. And when the curtain rose on our wedding day, it would not be the scene they had rehearsed. It would be mine. The morning of the wedding arrived cloaked in sunlight and ceremony, one of those unreasonably perfect days where the breeze was gentle, the sky brushed clean, and everything smelled faintly of roses and promises. The chapel. perched near the tree-lined edge of Lake Ashton, was already blooming with guests by the time I arrived. Its stained glass windows catching the light, like they had been waiting for this moment all year. On the surface, it was everything I'd once dreamed: white chairs, carefully arranged petals down the aisle, the string quartet warming up with something delicate and romantic, and yet, beneath it all, I felt a quiet tremor building. Not fear, but readiness. Nathan stood near the altar, perfectly composed in his slate gray tuxedo, casually checking his cufflinks as if he weren't standing on the edge of a cliff. He turned when he heard me, his face lighting up with that practiced smile, the one I'd memorized long ago, back when I thought it was real. "You look breathtaking," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. I met his gaze through the mirror as my maid of honor adjusted my veil, careful to keep my expression unreadable. "Thank you," I said softly. "Today will be unforgettable." Danielle, my sister, my traitor, was running late. The irony wasn't lost on me. I imagined her somewhere nearby, pacing, rehearsing the role she thought she'd be stepping into, still convinced I had no idea what she had done or who she was becoming. But I knew. I had known for weeks. And I was ready. The ceremony began with precision. The music swelled. The guests rose. I walked down the aisle with practiced grace, my heart steady, my mind a battlefield already cleared for the next move. Faces turned. Eyes filled with tears. No one knew yet. No one suspected the storm quietly swirling beneath the surface. As I reached the altar and stood beside Nathan, I noticed the tension in his shoulders, slight, almost imperceptible, but present, and it told me what I needed to know. He was nervous. Because deep down, even liars sense when the walls are closing in. The vows were minutes away when the double doors of the chapel burst open with a sudden crack that stole the breath from the room. A collective gasp followed as every head turned. Standing in the doorway, dressed in a white gown, not unlike mine, though less elegant, more desperate, was Danielle. Her eyes searched the crowd until they found mine. And there, in the middle of my wedding, she raised her chin and walked forward, slow, deliberate, each step a drumbeat of betrayal made manifest. "Nathan doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with jagged clarity. "He belongs to me, and the child I'm carrying." The air fractured. Guests shifted, shocked, whispers erupting like brushfire across pews and polished shoes. Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a breathless laugh, the kind that belongs to men who think they've already won. "Well," he said, facing the crowd, "I guess the surprise is out." I turned toward the congregation, calm as the lake beyond the windows. "Yes," I said clearly, "but not the whole surprise." And with that, I walked down the steps of the altar, removed the small flash drive from the bouquet I had carried so tightly in trembling fingers, and handed it to the officiant. "Play this," I said. "Everyone deserves to hear the truth." The screen flickered to life. We had arranged for a slideshow. After all, something to display photos from our journey. But instead of childhood memories or engagement photos, the chapel filled with the sound of recorded phone calls, text messages read aloud, and video footage showing Nathan and Danielle in meetings they swore never happened, in moments that painted a picture so vivid, so vile, even the air seemed to recoil from it. Gasps turned to shouts. Danielle's face went pale. Nathan's composure cracked. But I wasn't finished. Because just then, the chapel doors opened again. A woman stepped in, older than me, older than Nathan, her posture firm, her face familiar from the photos I'd seen in legal records and background searches. Megan Carlisle, Nathan's legal wife. She walked down the aisle slowly, eyes fixed on him. "You absolute coward," she said, her voice low and steady. "I warned you. I told you I'd come if you did this. And now, you're finished." Nathan stammered, something unintelligible, but it didn't matter. Megan continued. "He's been lying to everyone, not just to Margaret, to me, to the bank, to the investors. He's drowning in debt, and he's been using your wedding to float himself above water." She turned to Danielle, who looked like she might collapse. "And you, sweetheart, you're just another name in a long line of women he's promised the world to right before he leaves them behind." The chapel erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. I let them rise, let them burn. But I remained still, watching the unraveling of the web they thought they had spun tight enough to trap me forever. Nathan's parents were next. I had contacted them the week before. They entered with solemn expressions, having reviewed the folder I mailed them with bank statements, forged signatures, and damning proof of his financial schemes. His father, a quiet man with sharp eyes, looked at him once and then said simply, "You are cut off. Don't come home. Don't call." Nathan tried to protest, but the moment had turned. The congregation no longer saw him as charming or clever. They saw the man I had discovered manipulative, selfish, hollow. I stood, lifted my chin, and spoke not to him, but to the room. I gave him my trust. I gave her my love. And they thought that made me weak. But you don't destroy someone like me and walk away untouched. There was nothing left to say. So I stepped down from the altar and walked past them both, Danielle frozen, tears streaking her face. Nathan stunned, speechless, and I took a seat in the first pew, the one reserved for the mother of the bride. Because in that moment, I wasn't the betrayed fiancé. I wasn't the discarded sister. I was the woman who stood in her own wreckage, calm and upright, having turned the match back on the ones who struck it. And the fire was only just beginning. In the days that followed the wedding that wasn't, I found myself moving through time as if underwater, every motion deliberate, every breath weighted with something heavier than pain. It wasn't sorrow that held me in place, though grief clung to the edges of everything. It was the quiet echo of betrayal and the deeper stillness that comes with knowing the lies are no longer secrets. The masks were off, and what came next wasn't vengeance in the dramatic sense, it was justice. And justice, I had learned, moves with discipline, not rage. The courthouse in Ashton was small, unremarkable from the outside red brick, low windows, and the kind of linoleum floors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and nerves. But that courtroom, with its wooden benches and humming fluorescent lights, became the place where I reclaimed what had been taken from me, not just financially, but symbolically. Because in that room, Nathan Carlisle was no longer the charismatic businessman or the charming fiancé. He was a defendant, a man whose greed and manipulation had finally met something he couldn't talk his way out of. My attorney, a composed woman named Evelyn Pierce, presented the case with a kind of clinical precision I hadn't realized could feel so deeply personal. She laid out the paper trail, the stolen funds, the fraudulent transfers, the recorded admissions. Every line item, every call, every smug message that Nathan thought would remain hidden became evidence. And through it all, I sat silently, my hands folded in my lap, watching as the version of Nathan I had once loved disintegrated under the weight of the truth. He didn't look at me much. His posture was stiff, his face a mask of forced composure. I don't think it was shame. Men like him rarely feel shame, but it may have been the first time in his life he realized charm has a shelf life, especially when facts are being read into the record. When it came time for me to speak, I stood with a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed. I didn't raise my voice, didn't tremble, didn't ask for pity. I simply told the truth. I trusted him, I said, my voice firm but even. I loved him with the kind of hope that's born not from naivety, but from the belief that after everything I'd endured after losing my parents, after rebuilding my life piece by piece, I was finally safe with someone. And he took that belief and turned it into a weapon. I paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. He didn't just steal money. He stole time, dignity, and the last remnants of a future I thought we were building together. And he did it alongside someone who shares my blood, which makes this not just a case about fraud, but about the deep cruelty of premeditated betrayal. The judge listened carefully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. And when the verdict came, when the gavel fell with the authority of truth made tangible, I felt something unnameable loosen in my chest. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," he declared. "The defendant is hereby ordered to pay $75,000 in damages for financial misconduct, emotional distress, and contractual deception. Payment is to be made in full within 60 days or through seizure of assets as determined by court-appointed financial review." It wasn't the money that mattered, though. I would not pretend it meant nothing. It was the acknowledgement, the record, the fact that someone with a robe and authority had named what had been done to me and called it what it was, a violation. And Nathan? He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He simply stood, his jaw tight, as though the truth had finally cornered him in a way even he couldn't wriggle out of. But the reckoning didn't end with him. Danielle, who hadn't attended the hearing, sent a message days later, short, rushed, hollow. "I didn't know it would go that far. I didn't expect him to leave me," I thought. I thought we were building something too. But Nathan had fled. Disgraced and exposed, he disappeared from Ashton almost overnight, leaving Danielle behind with nothing but a child on the way and the wreckage of what she had chosen. She showed up once at my door, her eyes rimmed red, hands trembling. "I know I don't deserve it," she whispered, "but I'm alone, and I don't know what to do." I looked at her, not the sister from my childhood, not the girl who used to braid my hair and defend me at school, but the woman who had stood in front of me in white, believing she could rewrite history and replace me in my own life. "You made your choice," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. "And now you live with it." We haven't spoken since. Nathan's parents, who had once defended their son with the stubborn denial of parents unwilling to see the rot, released a statement to the press, confirming they were severing all financial and familial ties. "We are heartbroken," they said, "but our son's actions do not reflect our values. He will no longer be supported by the Carlisle family trust." They said more apologies, distance, a vow to right what they could, but none of it mattered anymore. I wasn't seeking closure from them. I had already found it. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in a courtroom that smells like lemon polish and dust, in the sound of a gavel falling, in the click of a door closing behind someone who thought you'd never have the strength to walk away and win. In the weeks that followed the court's ruling, my world began to settle into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, as though I were living inside a space that had once belonged to someone else, someone who had spent years bending herself to fit into a version of life others had drawn for her. The inn was quieter now, but in a comforting way, like the silence that follows the passing of a storm, not empty, just cleared of everything that didn't belong. Nathan was gone. Danielle, too. Their absences echoed at times, especially in the early mornings when the sunlight hit the kitchen counter in just the right way, or when I passed the room that once held boxes of wedding decorations I never unpacked. I didn't throw anything out in a fit of anger. I didn't break plates or burn letters or scream into the walls. I simply let things go, piece by piece, not because they didn't matter, but because I refused to let them matter more than my own healing. I still caught myself remembering, but the memories no longer burned, they pulsed faintly, like old bruises beneath the skin, reminders of where I had been, not definitions of who I was now. I didn't chase revenge beyond what was necessary to protect myself. The courtroom was never about punishing them, not truly. It was about reclaiming something they tried to take from me, my voice, my value, and the right to be the narrator of my own life. They had tried to write me out of my own story, but I had rewritten the ending, not with rage, but with truth. People in town asked questions, some curious, some concerned, and a few cruel in that subtle way small towns can be when gossip feeds more mouths than fact. But I held my head high, answered only what I chose to, and reminded myself that dignity doesn't require permission. Those who mattered didn't need an explanation. They just offered a hand on my shoulder or a seat at the table, and that was enough. The inn, once just a symbol of inheritance and duty, became something more intimate, a sanctuary of my choosing. I repainted the hallway Danielle once helped me decorate. I closed bookings for a week and took time to breathe without filling the silence. I spent quiet evenings with old records, familiar books, and the occasional letter from guests who had once passed through and remembered me fondly. Life became simpler. Not smaller, just more mine. One afternoon, I received a letter handwritten, the penmanship unfamiliar but careful. It was from another woman. Someone Nathan had wronged long before he ever walked into my lobby, someone who had found my name through court records and public filings. She didn't ask for details. She simply wrote, "Thank you for standing up. I wasn't ready to, but you reminded me it's possible." I sat with that letter for a long time, holding it like a torch passed in the quiet between survivors, because that's what this story became in the end, not a spectacle of revenge, but a quiet testimony of resilience. I hadn't needed to ruin them. They had done that to themselves. All I had to do was stop protecting their secrets and start protecting myself. Danielle never reached out again, and truthfully, I don't know what I would have said if she had. Some betrayals are so foundational, so bone deep, they don't leave room for reconciliation, only for release. Nathan, as I last heard, had fled the state, his accounts frozen, reputation crumbling. No longer the polished man who once sold me a future like a luxury product, He had gambled with people's lives and trust, and like most gamblers, he eventually ran out of hands to bluff with. But me? I stayed. I stayed, and I rebuilt. Not with haste, not with bitterness, but with intention. Every act of moving forward was quiet, deliberate, a reclaiming, not a reaction. And somewhere in the process, I found myself again. Not the version who waited for someone to love her right, but the woman who learned that she was enough not in spite of the scars, but because of them. If you're listening to this and something in you has cracked from betrayal, if you've been made to feel small, expendable, or invisible by people who once called you family, let me say this as clearly as I can. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not foolish for trusting. You are not weak for hurting. You are simply human. And healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from refusing to stay silent, from choosing yourself, and from walking away not bitter, but better. If this story moved you, helped you feel seen, or reminded you of your own strength, please consider subscribing. On this channel, we honor truth, resilience, and the quiet power of standing back up no matter who tried to knock you down. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is rebuilding with grace.